With us now is Dr. Martin Kulldorf. He is an epidemiologist and biostatistician, a professor of medicine at Harvard University. He is a founding fellow of the Academy of Science and Freedom. And you may know Dr. Martin Kulldorf because during the pandemic, there were a few very science-based doctors, epidemiologists, experts, scientists who came out and were very vocal against the government response to COVID. In fact, you may have heard of the Great Barrington Declaration. Dr. Martin Kulldorf was one of the authors of that declaration, which really just stated we should isolate the people who are the most vulnerable, and we should let the rest of society, people who are not at high risk, continue to live their lives. This was highly demonized. It was targeted even by Anthony Fauci to go out there and smear this document. That was publicized, and we discovered that through various different deep dives into what was really going on behind the scenes. Well, now Dr. Martin Kulldorf is a part of a group called the Norfolk Group, and they have put together a document, an 80-page document actually, that really dissects some of the really honestly piss poor responses of the pandemic. And this document is meant to go and help people, lawmakers, ask the right questions now that Republicans say that they're going to be investigating government's COVID response. So, Dr. Martin Kulldorf, thank you so much for being here on the show today to talk about this, what you guys discovered, and the questions we should be asking so that this never happens again.
Thank you, Kim. It's a great pleasure to be on your show.
Okay, so looking over this, let's just start. I do want to kind of dive into some of the questions that you have in this document for lawmakers to ask. First of all, is this document getting in front of lawmakers? Are they going to be asking these questions? Where are you with this?
Yes, so there is an interest among some lawmakers to get these questions, very science-based questions that they want to ask the CDC director, FDA director, NIH director, and so on. And we have sent it to some of them, and it's also publicly available. So any member of Congress or any member of a state House or Senate can access this document. They use it at COVID hearings or inquiries.
So now that we're a couple of years out, you've got even Joe Biden saying, okay, the pandemic's behind us. We're ending the emergency response. He mentioned it even in the State of the Union address. And, now looking back, what would you say was the most egregious aspect of the pandemic, of the response by governments?
If I could change one and only one thing, it would be the school closures. There were absolutely no reason to close schools. Children are at extremely low risk. They'll get COVID, but they're extremely low risk of serious disease or death, less than the typical influenza season. And there's enormous harm on children to keep them out of school for so long. Less learning. And we know that has long-term consequences, both in terms of future public health, future education, and economic viability for these kids. So to me, that's very tragic. And of course, it's harmed working class and poor kids the most, because we know that the kids of wealthy families, they went to private schools who kept open, or they were hiring tutors or pot schools and so on. So it affected mostly the working class and middle class children.
Yeah, I mean, the school closures definitely, and it's just, it was crazy to watch it happen when Democrats have always been the ones saying that we have to help, poor kids, we have to help people of color. And the kids that even did somewhat well during this were those that were from wealthier families, that were not the poor kids of color. It was wealthy families that did okay. And then the poor kids didn't even go to school. We found out they never even logged in to when they were supposed to be doing virtual education.
Many didn't log in at all, and even those that did, they didn't get they get a very substandard education. You can't do proper school online.
Yeah. In looking through some of these questions that you have in this document, which I just think are excellent questions, there were some things that I really wanted to focus on here. One of them being ivermectin. Okay, you're a very science-based guy. You have, throughout this entire pandemic, I've been following you. and you've always been really rooted in the science. One of the questions that you have in here, a good question, is why were some of these potential therapeutics demonized, right? Like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. Um, what do you say about that now? Like, do you think it was? What does the data say even about hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin? Were they effective? Um, obviously, I think there should have been a right to try. And ivermectin, now, one of the points that you guys made in this document was it was so demonized that even people who may have needed it for other reasons, for the purpose that ivermectin is made for, or that we know that it remedies, maybe some people weren't even able to get it for those ailments that ivermectin can cure. But what is your whole take on ivermectin in general and hydroxychloroquine?
So I think a key take-home message, the key question we're asking is why wasn't the studies conducted about these drugs at the very, very quickly and early? There should have been randomized trials very, very early on, both in more severe patients, hospitalized patients, as well as in as an earlier treatment for before people get hospitalized, to quickly find out whether these drugs work or not with large size samples. Now they became a very hot discussion: do they work or do they not work? And I think with hydrochloroquine, we find out pretty early on that they don't really help for hospitalized patients. But for the other questions, it took a long time before we got good information about the efficacy of these drugs. And that shouldn't have been the case. We knew they were safe because they've been used very long for other things. But it took far too long and therefore they became a controversy
Right.
whether these drugs should be used or not. And that should never have happened.
Yeah. Why do you think that? Why do you think it happened?
So I don't know why, because this was really the role of NIH, I think, to quickly run these studies, and they did a study very early on remdesivir. So that was good. They did that. There was a question: does remdesivir work or not? So they quickly did a large study, and we found that it didn't work very well. But then we need to know that, and we need to know it early.
Yeah. Um, why do you think the government was so slow to roll out, testing or, other things compared to really, let's focus on testing. That could have been helpful. Like if you're going to go visit your elderly, your grandparents or something, it would have been nice to have those tests early on to be able to help keep them safe. But, that obviously wasn't really the focus of the government. They were just trying to lock everybody down rather than doing what you guys had suggested with the Great Barrington Declaration. Why do you think that was?
So there's one thing that underpins this whole thing, and that's the second chapter of the 10 chapters in this 80-page document. And that's the fact that a lot of high-level scientists and government officials were questioning naturally acquired immunity after having had COVID, that is natural immunity. And that's very surprising because we've known for 2,500 years, since the Athenian plague 430 BC, that if you've had an infection, you get immunity, and it might not be lifelong, but it helps you so that you won't be at least severely ill a second time around. And this was questioned by a number of scientists in a memorandum published in the Lancet, which is the sort of a famous British medical journal, and it was questioned by the current CDC director. And to me, that is sort of underpinning a lot of things with, for example, testing and protecting the old. We should have used people who had recovered from COVID to take care of the older, frailer, high-risk patients in nursing homes and hospitals, because they're the least likely to transmit the disease, even less likely than the vaccinated. But instead, these people were fired for not being vaccinated. So it's the opposite. They should have been hired because they are the ones who have the best immunity. So I think that fundamental scientific flawed thinking underpins a lot of the mistakes that were made.
It just seems like so many people who are intelligent, educated, many of your colleagues, um, what do you, how did this happen to so many intelligent people that they just abandoned all known science? I mean, even in this document you talk about masking and how there's really no data that showed that masking would be effective. And yet they still, the governments and many even scientists and doctors suddenly demanded it on the entire population, on children endlessly, it seems. I mean, it just seems like people lost their minds. And, so there's this question, are they bought off? They worried that their labs aren't going to be funded or their research isn't going to be funded. Are they worried about their jobs being lost? Are they worried about, or is it just fear that took over and they really lost their minds and they were no longer science based for a period of time?
It might have been some of each. Like in 2020, there were very few scientists who were speaking up against the misguided pandemic policies. So if you listen to the media, you would have thought that the scientific community was all backing up Fauci and the CDC director and so on. But when I talk to my colleagues who are infectious disease epidemiologists, and I talk to them privately, most of them agree with me. So there were a lot of people who were silent, and some even said directly that they agree, but they dare not speak up. And that's not so surprising because the strategy, one of the big architects of the strategy was Anthony Fauci, who is the head of NIAID, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He sits, or he's resigned now, but he's sat on the biggest pile of infectious disease research money in the world. So if you're a scientist doing infectious disease research, you don't really want to get on the wrong side of Anthony Fauci, because then you might lose the funding that you depending on. Your family is dependent on it. Your colleagues in your lab, the people working in your lab, including lab technicians and so on, are dependent on it. So many people did not want to speak up because of that.
If the data had been different, we knew really early on that this COVID-19 really affects older people who are vulnerable, and the young and healthy largely escape any real damage, long-term damage, or even short-term. If it would have been different, really curious, would you have suggested a different strategy than the Great Barrington Declaration? Let's say it did harm children and young, healthy people, more like the flu of the Spanish flu. If it were something like that, what would you say would have been the right past this? Because I worry that we will have another pandemic. I think that and maybe the next time they'll make sure the message gets out there that no, this hurts everybody. This is young, old, middle of it doesn't matter. This is going to go after everybody. What would be the appropriate scientific response in that situation?
So in the Great Barrington Declaration, we argue for focused protection to protect those who are most vulnerable. And for COVID, that was the older people, and especially older, frail people. So if we have the next pandemic, and there will be more pandemics, and we don't know, you're right, that the 1918 flu affected younger people quite a lot. So if we have the next pandemic and it's mostly children who are dying, then we need to do focus protection still, but then the focus should be to protect those who are at high risk for that will be with children. So then we should protect things at schools and daycare center and so on. But the principle of focus protection, I think, is still valid. But those who we focus on might vary from one pandemic to the next.
Is there ever a scenario where it's everybody who's affected and we just all should go into lockdown and that is the best strategy? I mean, like the plague or something.
That's very hard to see because a lockdown cannot be sustained for forever.
Right.
So I have a very hard time to see a situation where everybody should go into lockdown. because we can't. It's impossible to do that also because we need food to eat. We need heat to heat our houses. We need electricity. So there are people who can have to make sure that those things function in society. So it's impossible to have everybody sit at home. I mean, some people in the laptop class, young professionals who maybe they are lawyers or bankers or marketers or scientists or whatever, journalists maybe.
Right.
Uh, they could sit at home, but they could only sit at home because there were other people who were servicing, who were delivering the pizzas, who were making sure the electrical grid was still working, who was making sure that the food was moving from the farms to the restaurants and so on. So it's impossible to lock down everybody.
Yeah, it just seems like that strategy wouldn't work no matter what. But that's constantly what I'm hearing from people is, yeah, but next time it could be something worse than COVID and it affects so many more people. And so therefore then the lockdown strategy would be a good idea. It is difficult to imagine how that would ever work in any circumstance, no matter what, because of all the things you just mentioned. And that was the saddest part to me during the pandemic was, for example, and I am I'm in that laptop class. My life actually didn't change work wise. Pandemic, I always worked virtually like I do now. Did during the pandemic, it was no different for me. But one of the saddest things was when I did order food delivery and I went out there to get the food from the woman who was delivering it, and she had her 3 kids in the back of the car, when they should have been in school. It was during the time of year where they could have been in school, and they could have, it was during the week, and, she's carting around her kids in the back trying to deliver food. Those kids, as we mentioned, were not getting their education. They couldn't. Who was gonna watch them? It was like it was the most nonsensical response without fully thinking, okay, so then, this woman has to work in order to pay bills and put food on the table. She's got her 3 kids, she can't leave them home alone. It was just extremely, but again, yeah, you're right. And a lot of people criticized and said, when I first came out against the pandemic lockdowns, people criticized and said, "Oh, you're for Wall Street. If you're not for shutting down, you're for Wall Street. If you think shutting down the economy, you want to open the economy up, that's just going to help Wall Street." And it was just such a disconnect of understanding what the economy actually is, and that is mom and pop shops, people that function, that make the world run. It's not Wall Street and investors and capitalists. It was just such a disconnect.
Well, it is because actually the big businesses did really well during the lockdowns. Amazon had record profits, and many other big businesses did very well. So it was the small businesses that was hit very hard. But I mean, it's no accident, I think, that Washington Post, who is owned by the same person that owns Amazon, Washington Post was very, very pro lockdowns, and that was very good for its owner.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, One last, just going forward, how, we've talked about some of your colleagues now being afraid, they were feeling, maybe privately they were on your side and they agreed with you. Publicly, they did not. What would you say we could do forward? It's just, I'm really nervous about another one of these happening. I know we're coming out of this one and people are going back to normal, but I'm just really nervous that this is going to be implemented again in some way. I mean, we've had numerous different viruses. They didn't have this effect, right? This lockdown of everybody, but every few years there's always this, oh, it's a bird flu or it's something, right? That's out there and more deadly than normal. Is there anything
So
that you've, yeah, go
that's the
ahead.
big reason why we wrote this document, the Norfolk Group, because uh, we have now, I mean, schools are open, so we won that battle and so on. But we have to make sure we don't make the same mistakes again. And to make sure that they don't, we have to have a full evaluation of everything that went wrong through congressional hearings and inquiries. But there should also, I think, be a COVID commission that looks into this and analyzes it properly, uh, because we can't ever let this mistake happen again. This is the biggest public health fiasco, I think, in history.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I hope that the people who are asking the questions, the people that are in a position, actually do something. I don't know what they're going to do once they get answers to these questions that you've put together. You know, they ask them, they get those answers. I don't know what they're going to do to implement to ensure this doesn't happen again. I don't know what they can do except point fingers and say, "You were bad, Anthony Fauci." But then what? You know, how are what kind of
I think
fundamental could they make?
there has to be a realization among the public at large that this was a mistake, and that the CDC and so on did not do its job properly, and so that next time around they are not allowed to get sort of a pushback from the public. The reason why the reason that things changed eventually was because of the public pushback. It wasn't the politician who changed it, or the journalists, or the like you, or the scientists like me. It came from the public pressure, and then the politicians had to follow, and the media had to follow, and eventually the rank and file scientists has to have to come along also. I don't think we're ever going to see the top scientists admit that they were wrong. They might realize it, but they're not going to admit it in public, I think.
Yeah, we're going to have this written down in the history books, taught in schools to children that this was a mistake. But I don't know if it's going to happen in our lifetime, if they'll admit it, or at least not for another couple of decades, unfortunately. Um, yeah. Real quickly, how are things for you? I mean, you were heavily demonized throughout the pandemic. Um, have people come back around and said, "All right, you know, I was wrong," and they are making amends with you, or
Well, me and my colleagues we were calling fringe epidemiologists by the NIH director, but I think that reflects more badly on him than it does reflect on us. And the same with some of the other pretty nasty or slandering comments from other scientists. But I have received many more positive comments from people I don't know, like just a random email, or if I give a talk, people are coming up. So the positive comments have been vastly more than the negative smearing that also has happened. But you can't take those things too seriously, I think.
well, I'm glad you have thick skin. And so hopefully you'll be around for the next time they try to unleash something like this on us, so that you can also give guidance and be around to help fight the battle against the tyranny all witnessed. I mean, it was just outrageous tyranny and just insanity. I don't know how else to describe
That's
it.
true.
So
No, that's a good description.
yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Martin Kulldorf. It is the Norfolk Group. This document, where can people get this document? You said this is publicly available?
It's public on the web at norfolk.org. So NORFOLK group, one word, .org.
Okay, norfolkgroup.org. And this document's great. It's not just a bunch of questions, there's a lot of information in it. So anybody that really wants to dive deeper into some of the mistakes that were made, many of the mistakes that were made during the pandemic, this document, like I said, it's about 80 pages long, actually does ask questions and gives a lot of background information. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kim. Fun talking to you.
You guys know that I have been personally really enjoying this. It's a powder made from real whole fruits and vegetables, freeze dried into a powder. You mix it into your drink. I like the lemon lime. That's my favorite one because it tastes like iced green tea with lemon. And you drink that and you feel healthier. And because it's giving you all of those nutrients that your body needs. And I'm just sitting here thinking, I am eating so much junk while traveling. I really, when I get home, I'm going to be doing like a cleanse and just drinking Field of Greens, because I've just been gorging out on stuff I shouldn't be eating, right, on this trip. And so, chicken fingers and French fries, and of course, plain food, and, I need to get healthy. So I'm going to be drinking that Field of Greens as soon as I get back. I'm going to be guzzling this stuff, I'm telling you, because I need some nutrients now. So go to fieldofgreens.com if you want to get 15% off your first order. It's fieldofgreens.com. And you can use the promo code Kim, and you will get 15% off that first order. Fieldofgreens.com.